Welcome to the NBAV podcast. Welcome back to NBAV, the NBA Avenue podcast, where there's many topics to discuss. Of course, starting with the passing of Bill Walton. I know that I put out one episode where I didn't talk about Bill Walton, but I was digesting all the content everyone else was putting out about him. And as a person who's on the younger side, but not as young as the the generations today, I got to see basketball from the early 2000s, and then I got to watch back the finals of Michael Jordan. I got to watch back the finals of Magic Johnson. I got to watch back a lot because if you're a basketball fan, there's so much that's available of the yesteryears on YouTube and elsewhere on different avenues and online. You can really get a good glimpse of what players were like, and I did, well before the passing of Bill Walton, watch the highlights and some of the games of Bill Walton and his championship in Portland. And he was a player that kind of stood out to me. Well, obviously because I was literally searching for his highlights. So it's simple to say that it's going to stand out. But even amongst the great players, I was always fond of Bill Walton relative to players that other people liked. I always held him in a different sort of level of esteem, and maybe it's because the people who I enjoyed listening to also felt the same about Bill Walton, and then that kind of got passed down to me. And there's always going to be younger fans coming into it, and what really gets given over is what we give over. So it's the people who got to see those before Jordan and going all the way back. I was talking with my grandfather the other day, and he actually mentioned to me that he believes he was at the game that Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points. Now, I don't know if he's remembering correctly or not, but he said he thinks he was there. And I said, well, you don't know if you were at that game that Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points? And he said, I think I was there, but if I wasn't there, I definitely watched it on television. But I think I was there. I think I was at that game. So I don't know if he was there or not, but it's just interesting. And then I had more of a basketball conversation with him, which is something that I never really did. And he was telling me about some of the great players of old. And it was interesting to hear about it. And every now and then you run into an older person and they can kind of fill you in. And then you hear people like Bill Simmons. You hear people older than Bill Simmons like Mike Francesa. You could talk with your parents and you can hear about these great players. And from watching what Bill Walton did on that Portland Trailblazers team, you could see what these guys are talking about when they say how if you play basketball the right way, it pays dividends. And it wasn't that he was a three-point shooter, right? That wasn't a thing back then. But it was that he was a guy who got every rebound, a guy who played phenomenal defense. And it makes you think about what is in the future for the NBA, where now you think of a player who people like to compare him with, Nikola Jokic, because Jokic is a great passer. And Walton was a great passer. But truthfully, after discussing it with my dad, my father says that Bill Walton reminds him more of, Jokic reminds him more of Larry Bird. In the sense that Jokic is a pretty good shooter for a big man, but it's the passing. It's the incredible circus passing, which kind of reminds you a little bit of the passing that Larry used to do. Now, there's many other facets of Larry's game, which I wouldn't say Jokic necessarily has. But I wouldn't say that Jokic is too similar of a player to what Bill Walton was. Bill Walton was defense rebounding. Get the rebound and go. And that was what you can see, even if you watch the highlights of it. And he kind of, with his hand gestures and the play calling, he was manning the offense, but he was manning the defense in a way which we don't really see anybody man the defense like that today. You see sort of team defensive efforts, right? Like you saw with the Pistons when they won their title against the Lakers with the Wallaces and with Chauncey. And you see it with the team defense that Minnesota is playing right now on occasion, and they're losing the series right now. But you saw it when they faced off against Denver in some of those games. But to see a classic center, a defensive anchor, a guy who gets every rebound and goes, a la Bill Russell, and those guys, it makes you think that there's going to be another guy like them one day. I don't know if there's going to be another player exactly like Bill Walton or if there's going to be another player exactly like Bill Russell, but it does make me think that one day we're going to see, in the next couple of decades, we're going to see a player who gets every rebound, a big man, a 7-footer, who gets every rebound, who doesn't light it up from three-point range, doesn't have that element of his game, but just through rebounding and defense is going to be more of an anchor than we've ever seen for the last 30 years. It makes me think of, maybe I shouldn't say that because really we had Tim Duncan. And Tim Duncan, maybe as a power forward, not a center, however you want to categorize him, but the guy who's going to get every rebound and is going to make it very tough on the other team and make fundamental shots. And we're going to see another guy like that. I think Anthony Davis had a chance to be that, in a way. If you watched what he did in college, he had the ability to put his handprint all over the game, even in a championship game like he did it, and not really score any points by halftime, but block a whole bunch of shots, get all the rebounds, and have your team win and control the entire game without necessarily having to score and without necessarily having to be too flashy, not have to get too many assists. But I think he had an opportunity to be in that sphere talent-wise, and he just never did. He's still a very good player, but he was never in that sphere. But it gives me hope that we're going to see another player like that. Because if you consider Bill Walton and you consider Bill Russell, and then you say, well, we also had a guy like Tim Duncan who, in the fundamental sense, kind of did that, and you see how dominant those players were, or at least how dominant they were while they were healthy. It gives hope to think there's going to be another guy like them, and that's very interesting to think about. This is also a time where we're talking about centers. Not just the centers who are no longer here, but Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert. They won last night. I was watching all the Minnesota fans on Twitter get dejected down 0-3, and I reminded them, I would respond to their comments and say, this is a very resilient Wolves team. This is not the type of team that gets swept. Granted, I picked Dallas to go all the way to the finals. But still, I didn't expect them to sweep Minnesota, and I didn't expect Dallas to win Game 4. I expected Minnesota to win it. Because that's who they are. They're not the type of team that rolls over. Sure, maybe they're the type of team that does stupid fouls. Maybe they're the type of team that over-pursues. Maybe they don't have the perfect guy to defend Luka like they did in other series where they could defend Jamal Murray. They had the perfect guy to defend him, but they can't stop Luka in that same way. They can't bring that same defensive effort against Luka and Kyrie. It just doesn't match up as perfectly. But Minnesota's not the type to roll over and lose 4-0. They have too much respect for themselves. They believe too much in themselves to do that. And you think about Karl Anthony Towns in a game where he was really good down the stretch, and he hit some massive three-pointers, and you think, well, hey, if he's hitting his threes, and he's able to get to the basket, and not only is he able to drive to the basket, but he's also able to dish the ball to Rudy Gobert on a lot of those drives and get easy dunks for Gobert. And you think just how incredible of a player he's able to be, not nightly. He's not super consistent. Sometimes he plays extremely well, and sometimes he takes you out of the game. He's volatile. He's completely volatile. And you think, well, this is a guy who doesn't even have any footwork. And this is a type of era where you need footwork in two ways if you're a big man. Because he's a big man who shoots threes. That means that he needs footwork at the basket, right? Thinking more in the realm of the way Hakeem Olajuwon played. He needs that type of footwork. And then he also needs footwork when he's operating at the three-point line because he likes to drive to the basket as well. So he needs to be able to fake and shoot and step back, go right, left. He needs to do all of that. And he gets called for a ton of offensive fouls when he's driving, and it's because he doesn't have this footwork. If you would take the Luka Doncic footwork and add that into Karl Anthony Towns, it would be one of the greatest players we've ever seen. Karl Anthony Towns has no footwork. And he's still able, on a lot of these games, to make an incredible impact. Just because of size and athleticism and shot making. The guy's already making the max. He's already going to make over $60 million next year, and he doesn't even have the footwork element to his game. There's so much he can work on. And then, on the opposite side, you have Rudy Gobert, and he's not very volatile at all. He's got the consistency. He does it every night. He puts forth a good defensive effort. And people get upset at him. And I watch Rudy Gobert, and I think, well, this guy, like a friend of mine described maybe a decade ago, he said, Rudy Gobert is a championship center. You can win a championship with Rudy Gobert as your center. And I thought about that over the years following, and I agree. I think that Rudy Gobert is the kind of guy where, as your center, you can win a finals with him. If you would stick Rudy Gobert onto the Oklahoma City Thunder, I would be inclined to think that would be a perfect pairing that can maybe end with them in the NBA Finals. Just think about that. Think about where a team like Oklahoma City could be. Think about it where Minnesota is with Rudy Gobert. He's very vital to that team. And the only reason why they're able to account for the volatility of Karl Anthony Towns is because they have Rudy Gobert and because they have Naz Reid. So you're judging these players when you're judging them on a team where they have three guys who basically can play the same position. So how do you judge them? And I think you have to judge it where Karl Anthony Towns cannot be the best player on a team. Rudy Gobert cannot be the best or second best player on a team. But he can be the center and be the third and take you to the finals. So I think everyone's hard on Rudy. But you know what you're going to get. Whereas Karl Anthony Towns, you have no clue what you're going to get. His ceiling is very, very high. But he's just totally volatile. And then you have probably the guy who you would want over both of them would maybe be Naz Reid, which is just crazy to think about that you have three guys there, and if you had to pick one of them to have on your team, you might take Naz Reid because the ability to stretch out to the three-point line as a big man is, in this day and age, is a killer dagger to have in your pocket. And I'm not saying for sure you would take Naz Reid over Karl Anthony Towns, but I think at the price tag you would for sure. And then it would be a legitimate question of which guy you would take, which guy you would want. But on the right team, in the right spot, all of these guys are capable of helping you win a championship. Frankly, I think the guy who's the toughest to see how he could help you win a championship of the three is probably Towns because of his craziness. And the only reason this is working out for him somewhat is because he's on just an insane, absolutely insanely stacked team. And talking about stacked teams, let's move over to Boston, who's waiting for somebody to make it to the finals along with them. They're waiting to see who their opponent is. And you hear all the talk about Boston, and you hear the talk of Jrue Holiday. And some people think he should have been the Eastern Conference MVP over Jaylen Brown even because of the impact that he had out there. And people are talking about Jrue Holiday and the incredible player that he is and how great it is that Boston has him. And it's another case where you just can't judge. Because Boston has an embarrassment of riches to a level that shouldn't even be possible. To have Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Jrue Holiday, Derek White, Porzingis as a starting five shouldn't be something that should even be possible. And then they have a very strong bench as well. It should not be possible. And they're talking like, oh, Jrue Holiday, yeah, he's a great player, but you can't rely on him as a 1 or a 2. But if you have him as a 3 or a 4, then you're in really good shape. And it's like, yeah, well, that was always the case. Jrue Holiday wasn't the number 1 ever. He was on a team with Giannis that won the title. He had Middleton playing extremely well as the number 2, and Jrue Holiday came up with timely plays. And that's really what he does on Boston. He comes up with a timely basket, a timely steal. And it's so important to have that guy who could steal the ball in a real moment of need. We've seen Luka come up with some big steals in these playoffs, and we've seen Anthony Edwards do the same thing. We've seen Jaden McDaniels do that as well. We've seen some guys in Oklahoma City do that. Back in the day, if you were a Knicks fan, that was what Walt Frazier used to do. He would just come up with the steal in the final minute, and it would just be Frazier steals the ball, and then he'd be on the move. And that kind of ability to get that steal when you really need it is so valuable, and you saw it in Boston's victory right there at the end in the penultimate game against the Indiana Pacers. He got the steal that sealed the game. It led to the bucket. It's the timeliness. Jrue Holiday has in his possession the timeliness factor, where he makes the right play at the right time. He makes that killer three-pointer when you need it. He gets to the basket at a time when you need it for a three-point play. He gets the steal when you need it. Jrue Holiday he's had a strange career where for a while he's known as this guy who's just overpaid. And you think he's overrated. And then when you see him on a really good team, the whole narrative about him shifts 180 degrees. And you start to say, this guy's underrated on Milwaukee. And then when Milwaukee doesn't play as well because Middleton isn't able to fill that number 2 role for a little while with his injuries, and suddenly you think Jrue Holiday's a second scorer on your team, they got fed up with him. And then when he ends up on Boston, suddenly he's the second coming of Jesus. Because they have this embarrassment of riches. Jrue Holiday as the third or fourth guy, as the guy who's able to settle in and make his timely plays, play his tough defense, and then make the timely play. That's Jrue Holiday. Don't mistake him for a 1 or a 2. He's not even a 3 in this case, probably. He's a split 3 with Porzingis and also with Derek White. And then they have Al Horford coming off the bench as the super sub. And then they have more after them. So let's not get it twisted. Boston has an amazing team, and that's why they're in the finals waiting. And it's not because Jrue Holiday is the Eastern Conference Finals MVP. He's not. And that's where we are right now. We're in a whirlwind of discussions. There's some trade talk, but it's hard to take anything seriously until the season is over. There's some draft talk, but it's hard to focus on that with the state of the weekend draft and with the season still going on. We're not even in the finals yet. And you have just the narratives swirling about Minnesota, the narratives about Gobert, the narratives about Towns, Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, the trades that they made to get to where they are now with Washington and with Gafford, the reemergence of Jones, of Derek Jones Jr., and like we said, Kyrie Irving, and of course Luka Doncic, and Minnesota. Anthony Edwards, Karl Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert. And this is what we're talking about. And this is what we'll continue to talk about for the rest of the Western Conference Finals as long as it lasts. Dallas should finish them off in one of the next 2 games. And then we'll have the ultimate matchup, which we predicted, of Dallas against Boston in the finals. As always, NBAV, we're your source for a great time every time. And until next time, we are out.